So we are starting our federalism unit. During our last unit, we talked about the separation of powers and the idea that each of the three branches of government had their own powers so that no one branch would become more powerful than another. And then we talked about how power was going to be even further divided between the federal or the national government and state governments. And that's what federalism is. So the national government and the state governments working together. So first, let's start with the different systems of government. So the first is the unitary system, and this is where one central government exercises authority over subnational governments, such as states. So under these unitary governments, there is a single governing authority and a central capital with uniform law throughout the land. And the central government can delegate power, but they can also take back power. And countries that have this unitary system of government include the United Kingdom, China, and Iran. And you can see here where the unitary central government is going to exercise control and authority over those state governments. So that's just a depiction of that. The next type of government is the confederal government system. And this is what we had in the United States under the Articles of Confederation. And this is where subnational or state governments are going to hold most of the power. And the national governments are going to depend on states to carry out and pay for public policies. So think back to when we talked about the Articles of Confederation. The national government didn't have any taxing power. In order for them to get any kind of funding, they had to get money from the states. Okay, so they were dependent on the states to carry out and pay for any kind of public policy. And then the last system of government is the federal system, and that's what we have here in the United States now. That's what's set up under the Constitution. And in a federal system, power is going to be divided between the states and the national government. So we talked about under the Constitution, the national government has powers, and then there are some powers that are reserved specifically to the states. So each level of government is going to retain some exclusive powers and has some that are denied to it. So there are powers that are specifically granted to the national government, and then there are powers that are specifically granted to state governments. So we, the United States, have a federal system as well as Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia. And this is just a good depiction of how the power is going to be divided in each of these systems, if you want to take a little further look at that. So let's talk about national and state powers. We touched on enumerated and expressed powers in the last unit. So we talked about how in the Constitution there are specific powers that are granted to the national government, especially Congress, in that document. So the founders knew that national needs were going to require some consistency across state lines. So no matter what state you were in, these needed to be consistent laws. So things like having some kind of uniform weight and measurement system, having a national currency. So these are the type of powers that they are going to grant to the national government. So things like coining money, declaring war, raising an army and a navy, making treaties. Those are powers specifically given to Congress in the Constitution. Then there are implied powers, and these are the powers that aren't specifically granted to the federal government. But under that necessary and proper clause, it says that Congress can make laws to carry out its enumerated powers. So in our last unit, we talked a little bit about the draft and how the draft would be an example of an implied power. Here it talks about the authority to create an air force. So when the Constitution was drafted, airplanes didn't exist. That wasn't a thing. So nothing about raising an air force could be put in the Constitution. However, because Congress has the expressed or enumerated power to raise an army or a navy, it is implied that they also have the authority to create an air force. However, the Constitution does deny certain powers to the national government, like prohibiting taxes on goods and services exported and imported between states. So go back to that Constitutional Convention, and we talked about the 3/5 Compromise and all of those other compromises regarding slavery. Remember that the national government was going to be prohibited from ending the slave trade for 20 years. So the Constitution does deny some powers to the national government. So let's talk about some of the different clauses that affect federalism. And the first one, and one that I really want you to understand, is the Commerce Clause. Now, I'm going to include another video with this lesson just because I think it does a good job of illustrating what the Commerce Clause means. So the Commerce Clause grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states. So combined with other clauses, Congress has claimed authority to define nearly any productive activity as commerce. So Congress has used this Commerce Clause to essentially gain more power. And we've already talked about the Necessary and Proper Clause. And this gives Congress the power to make laws as necessary to carry out its constitutionally granted powers. So we talked about the draft, about creating an Air Force, and how Congress is able to do that through the Necessary and Proper Clause. And the last one is the Supremacy Clause. And in the Supremacy Clause, it says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So what this means is that the Constitution comes before any state law. States must abide by laws that are passed by Congress. States must abide by national treaties. And state courts have to follow the Constitution. So Constitution, federal law comes before state law. And that is where we are going to stop with this lesson.